Actually, so this is CodePen. And CodePen is just a front-end playground. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, just the things that run in the browser. You can do like CodePen projects and stuff now, but this is really what I've used this the most for. And we're going to input, but we're going to write a tiny bit of HTML, but then we're going to, I wonder, okay, that doesn't change anything. Then we're going to hit a public API using jQuery, and then we're also going to hit that same public API using the fetch method in JavaScript, and take the data that we get back and append it to the DOM using jQuery in this instance. So some similar things to the Rails and jQuery project. Name.
Yeah, I'm just finishing the Ajax section, so this would be a good review.
Cool, yeah. Perfect. No class post. Welcome. Somebody else joining up with us. Yeah, perfect. That's all that we need in our HTML. So yeah, the idea being, you know, we're going to use GitHub's public API. We're going to type in somebody's username, like mine. Click Get Followers. It's going to show the person's real name based on the information we get back from GitHub, and then an unordered list. You know, we have the UL here, but a bunch of LIs, list items of the followers. But before we dive into that, let's talk about what an API is. So in the context of what we're talking about tonight, you know, when we visit URLs, for most websites, the response that we get back in our browser is going to be HTML, or a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You know, it's data and presentation. If we go to my GitHub profile, GitHub URL, you know, we see images, we see styling, you know, this is bold and underlined and blue, and we see green, and we see the contributor heat graph thing, some other information, some links. If we want more information, we can click and see new things. So really, you know, we see that there's data and presentation, and it's presented in this visual way because for us, you know, end users, the average user, this is the easiest way to interact with this, you know, by pointing and clicking and doing things like that. Now, some web applications go a step further and provide the data with respect for their application for other applications to use. And they do this via an API. And an API is a series of endpoints. An endpoint is a synonym for URL. So an endpoint is just something, a URL like we type into our browser bar, that provide specific data. So URLs that provide specific data are called endpoints. And then from there, the builder of the application, which is going to be us this evening, can decide how to present that data. So, you know, we're going to decide how do we want to put this data to use. Now, most modern web APIs these days use JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, as a standard way of describing and defining data. So, you know, that we understand that it's going to be structured in a certain way, follow certain conventions in how the data is structured. Some older APIs use XML, though they are really rare in my experience. So rare that I've never seen one. I do know that they exist out there, so it's worth mentioning. And then, yeah, the reason it's called Ajax, A-J-A-X, is because of XML. You know, it's an acronym for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And if we were to change that, swap out the X for a J, I don't really know the best way to pronounce that. So Ajax just stuck. And some newer APIs are utilizing something called GraphQL, which is actually a query language. So it's a little bit different in how it works, but just that is popping up here and there. So I like to mention it. But by far and wide, the most popular type is, you know, a RESTful structured JSON API. So let's start looking at some code. We've got our HTML already. We are going to use jQuery for some stuff. So let's add jQuery to this. Oh, let me click save. And I'll just save as anonymous. And I'm going to put this into the Zoom chat. So this will be here for you, and it will persist even after we're done with this study group, with this discussion. So you can go back to it, you can play with it. Depending on how far we get, there might be some things at the end that you can do on your own. But yeah, that'll be there. This will be here for you. But yeah, let's add jQuery to this project. In CodePen, we do that by hitting this little gear. And then we can add external scripts. So I'll just type in jQuery here. And here's jQuery. I click it, and I click save. And now jQuery is available. So when we use $, we have jQuery working. Okay. Let's look at a payload from hitting a GitHub API endpoint. Payload being the data, you know, what is shown to us. So instead of this, let's go to api.github.com. We can say /users/it's api.github.com/users. Oh, there's no trailing slash. So I use Firefox, and it automatically formats this and turns it pink and blue and stuff. But the raw data right here we see is just a representation of a JavaScript object. So an object can't travel across the wire, or it can't be sent from a server to a client, because what defines that object is the memory location that it occupies. So we get what looks like an object, but it's really just a string. And if we look, I've found that Safari actually will show it in its completely raw fashion. We see, you know, this is all that there is. And if we even inspect the page, we see that this entire thing is wrapped in a quote at the beginning and a quote at the end. It's just one long string on the page. You know, there's just some standard styling that I think Safari's putting on here, because that's not coming from the API at all. And then it's just a string. So we'll quit that. So cool. So we're seeing what data we're expecting to get in our application. So now we're going to start to build out the UI in CodePen to consume that payload. Oh, and I usually say it at the beginning where I forget. Anytime you have any questions, I'm going to do check-ins, you know, stop at points and ask, you know, how we doing, how we feeling, comfortable with these things. I'll ask some questions. But really, if there's anything along the way, any syntax, any questions about anything that I'm doing, just shout them out. Or if you can't unmute yourself, throw them in the Zoom chat, and I will get to them. I don't always see the chat right away because it's on a different screen than the one that I'm sharing, but I do see it, and we'll get to it eventually. Typically, it won't take that long. But yeah, let's start really, getting some data from the endpoint into our JavaScript code. So we're going to use jQuery's Ajax method. Now, Ajax itself is just an acronym for a way of coding, a way of writing code. So asynchronous JavaScript. So that's just a type of JavaScript, JavaScript that's asynchronous. And XML. So now that would be and JSON. So asynchronous JavaScript is how we communicate with servers to get the data or send the data. And then JavaScript object notation, JSON, is kind of the structure that we use to communicate that data back and forth. So jQuery has this Ajax method, and we're going to use this to get the data, to consume our payload. So I'm just going to copy this link to start. URL. And then we'll have a type of get. And success takes a callback function. That receives data. And we'll console log that data. And since CodePen automatically saves for us, this has saved and run, and there's a built-in console here. So click console. We'll see the data here that we were seeing in our browser by just typing the URL in. So we have successfully consumed the payload from that endpoint. And that being, our data is now in our code. It is this data variable. We have it available to us to do stuff with. Now, there's actually two different ways to write this Ajax method. I'm actually going to switch it to the other one now. Let's take this. And this is more because I feel like this just looks more like what we get used to. Close that. In our JavaScript, when we start dealing with promises and stuff. Okay, all that works because it tidied up just fine. So instead of taking that success key, which takes a callback function, we have this done, which takes a function. And I don't know if you noticed, but this actually loaded again. It's been loading, so let's clear this one time to make sure this is still working right. I think if I just delete this semicolon, it'll run again. Maybe not. I think I need to actually do something. So that'll break it, and that'll fix it. I'll put another space up here. That'll make it refresh. Okay, so we refresh and we see we're still getting the same data, so everything's still working right. Cool. Sweet. So we went through a good amount of terminology just now. How comfortable are we feeling with everything we've discussed so far? APIs, endpoints, consuming payloads, Ajax.
I feel okay with it. I don't recall seeing this particular structure of an Ajax request in the curriculum.
Okay. And that very well may be true. I can't remember exactly the Ajax section, and I know it's been updated since I've seen it anyway, or since I've looked at it. But yeah, and we'll keep moving, and it might look more similar, or it might not. But yeah, this is we're not doing the XML HTTP request. We're going to use jQuery's Ajax method, and then we're going to use fetch. Fetch, which is kind of the next iteration of that XML HTTP request. That's in the web API. So cool. Let's start making this interactive. So, we went through what we want this to do in the end. So let's start working towards that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to target this button, because when we click this button is when we want stuff to happen. So what selector should we use for this button, this get followers button in this application? That might.
Just button?
Yeah. So button is going to be our best selector. We typically want the most specific selector we can get, but there's only one button on the page, and there's no other, ID or class or anything on this button. So we can use button in this case. I was just about to answer his question. You had to go. What's the difference between fetch and get? But fetch, we'll see, is a JavaScript method, and get is an HTTP verb. It's the type of request. But yeah, so we got button, and I'll say on click function, and this is going to end up inside of there. Cool. There's probably some sort of keyboard shortcut for that, but that works. Okay, so now we'll set a variable username equals all right, and what is our selector for this input field?
Hashtag text. No, hashtag user input.
Yes, perfect. And do you know what function we call on this to get, when I type in, to get this text out of it?
Dot value.
So dot val. Every single person, I don't think anybody's ever gotten that. Everybody always says dot value. So that's very, very common. I think that's in just regular JavaScript, like vanilla JavaScript is how you get it using dot value. But dot val. So that val will get us our info, and we can double check that. We'll do console log username and see if this is working the way we want. This is kind of my standard practice. I'll write something and then do something like this, and then I'm going to console log my variable. And I want to see, one, is my line 1 working? So when I click the button, is it doing is it firing? And then number 2, is this variable what I think it is? Because if we're trying to use this variable in our code down here somewhere, and it's not what we think it is, we have errors before we even get to where we're trying to use things.
If we had multiple buttons, would that selector just select the first button or all the buttons?
I think it selects them all. We can find out though, real quick. Let's do it. There. So let's see if this will select both. I'm going to comment this out, or just cut it for a second, because there is a limit on how many times we can hit the GitHub API without an access key. So while we're playing around with this, I just don't want to keep hitting the API. Okay, let's Let's see. Okay, well, there's nothing in there, but we still see we got something. So it worked there, and it worked there too. So yeah, everything that this matches, it'll match with.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, and that's something that's cool about CodePen too. Like when you really want to play around with something and you have that type of question, sometimes it's kind of obscure and hard to fit those types of things into your code to play around with. So you can go to something like CodePen and do something like this real quick and say, okay, now I know. Because I know I've used CodePen a lot for like messing around with CSS and trying to play with things and getting them where I want. And then afterwards, just copying and pasting it into my code. I built a whole CSS grid once, and it was just way simpler to mess around with it here and watch it refresh quickly and then dump it into my code. But yeah, it'll match all of them. And that's why we typically like using an ID for something like that, because typically we only want one specific thing to trigger an event. Okay, so that's updated. So we've got our username. Sweet. So next step. Right now, every time we click the button, we're just getting, my GitHub information back. But we don't want that. We want whatever username we type in here to, return. If we want surname B, surname, and click get followers, we want to see his data, not mine. So how would we change this URL here on line 5 to utilize this variable that we've just created on line 2?
We changed the quotes to backticks, and then we replaced its Zaga with a string interpolation of username.
Yes, perfect. So that should do it. We'll double check that. We do see different information, login, surname, name, location. So yeah, that's doing it for us. Perfect. Awesome. And lastly now, instead of console logging, we want to put the name, right here. So one thing of note is that even though we looked and saw that our payload is a string, we can't send a JavaScript object over the network. If we look at our console, we see that the type of this is object. Now, this is something that jQuery is doing for us. If we look in the docs for this Ajax method, it tells us that jQuery looks at the headers of the response. We sent a GET request and it's getting a response, and looks at the headers, response headers, at the content type. And this is application/JSON. And then from there, it will infer that, this is JSON structured and convert it to a JavaScript object. So that's something that jQuery is doing for us. It's just nothing, we don't have to do anything to turn this into an object and work with it. jQuery is taking care of that for us, which is pretty cool. We'll see how Fetch handles that here in a little bit. So instead of just console logging this data, because that's not what we want to do, let's stick it on the DOM. So we'll have our selector first, and we want to put it right, in this white space right here. So what selector will we use to get, that element?
Hashtag name.
Yes. And then, do you know a method we could use, jQuery method, to add something to this?
I know, I think in original, in vanilla JavaScript, it would be .innerHTML plus equals, right?
Yes, that sounds right. I haven't done a lot of vanilla JavaScript DOM manipulation recently. But yeah, so that is essentially equivalent to append. And I know, this is a Ajax API's study group discussion, so I'm not gonna hold out for you to look up a jQuery method. That documentation is there, and I'm sure you could find it. But append. And then this is more something I have a question for you for. So we have this JavaScript object, and it is assigned to this data variable. How can we get the name off of it? We want the value of this name key.
Object.name.
Okay, so you're right on target.
I don't know what the object's called, though. What are we referring to the object as? Would it be data.name?
Yes. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, this is the variable that we've assigned to it. So in this code, what the response, the data from this GET request to this URL is going to be passed into this function. And we assign it a name. So I wrote data there, but we could call it whatever we want as long as it's consistent. So, this could just be response. And then it would be response.name. But I think data is good. And the reason I would differentiate data personally is because the actual raw response is this. It's not a JavaScript object, and jQuery has converted into this object for us, so it's more like data now. And that's kind of how I think about it. But let's see if it works. Sweet. We see it in the DOM. Let's save that. Now, we do have a preference when we're writing our code for named functions over anonymous functions. So this right now is an anonymous function. So we would want to, or we would prefer to refactor this into a named function. So something like this. Let me grab all of this. Oh, too far. Function, let's say user success. Now let's clean that up. All right. Now, a couple things might jump out at you.
Yeah, when you say done user success, do you need to put the data argument in there, or does it just automatically pass?
So it will implicitly pass that data to this function and invoke it. So that's something that is enabled through the promise chain. So because this is asynchronous, this is dealing with, under the hood, this Ajax method is returning a promise and doing some things so that, if it takes 20 seconds for this Ajax call to return, the JavaScript code will keep going on. Asynchronous JavaScript and how it works and all that is the topic of a different study group, but just knowing that this is asynchronous, and the promise chain passes the return from each prior piece of the chain through to the next piece. So, I was saying the response, jQuery changes that response a little bit, and then passes it along into this done. And user success is implicitly invoked, and the first argument of user success, if we don't provide one, is going to be that return value that's being passed in from the previous part of the chain. And at first I thought this might just be a jQuery thing, but it works also with the fetch API, and the fetch API uses just straightforward promises in the promise chain. So yeah, it looks odd, and I need to write myself a note to confirm this or not. I don't think many people know this, and I actually want to ask my coworkers and say, hey, do you know how this works? Because if they're all like, no, then I will probably highly suggest to students to like not write this code, because nobody's ever going to know what it does without asking questions. And we want our code to not only work, but to be easy for other people to read. So the way that I would probably write this is we can create an arrow function and pass data in this way. And while we're still creating an anonymous function right here, all we're doing here is invoking this function. So I think that's clearer. It's more explicit what's going on. Where's the data coming from? Where's it going to? How is it being passed in? I think that's clearer. So you're spot on noticing that, that looked weird. We weren't invoking it at all. There was no parentheses and we weren't passing the variable at all, but it was still hooked up and wired up. I guess we never actually ran this to watch it work. So let's do that, because I think just seeing it. So it does work. And then on the opposite side, so they both work. I think this one's going to be conceptually, quote unquote, better. More people are going to understand it easier, easier. But back to named functions. We have this preference, and it's for a couple different reasons. One, it separates our concerns. It really keeps this Ajax method up here only working with the data. It's not dealing with the DOM at all. It's just saying, hey, go get the data. When you get the data back, pass it off, and we're going to do stuff for the DOM with it. Something else is it allows us a little bit more flexibility in the end if we need to make this function larger, smaller. I think sometimes writing it where it works here first and then refactoring it out is definitely a good way to go. But you'll find that sometimes these functions start to grow. You'll want to add more functionality and things. So you typically end up breaking it out anyway. So just doing that from the beginning is useful. And lastly, a named function makes us hunting down bugs much, much, much easier, because our stack traces will have those function names in them. So that is the third reason, and probably the most helpful reason, that you're not pulling your hair out, because none of your functions are named and they're all anonymous, and you just get this stack trace with not the greatest information to go find issues with. Yeah, that's our thought process on using named functions. All right. And typically do a check-in, but you're talking pretty regularly. So I feel like if you have a question, you're going to ask it. So yeah, just to reiterate, if you have a question, just let me know.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So next, we need to get the followers. And if we look at our first payload, our endpoint, we see that there's actually a followers URL in this response. So we see the followers URL here. So if we go there, we see we get what is a representation of an array of objects. We have the square bracket, and then we have object inside of there. Now we have a few of them.
So is this a true array, or is this one of those array like node-like arrays, that type things?
So this will be a true array. And we'll see that when we consume it. But yeah, this is just going to be a standard array. In JSON, you're not going to have really odd things. You're just really going to have objects. You're going to have your primitives for the most part, and arrays. So we see the URL is just a little bit different. And we'll use fetch this time. So fetch is part of the web API, it's part of JavaScript. And by default, it is a GET request. So fetch can take an object, very similar to Ajax. And it would take in a URL key and a type and such. But by default, it's a GET request, and that's what we're doing. So we can just pass in a string, and we'll do the same thing with our username variable. And then after that, we move down the chain with .then. So .then, I'm actually going to console log response. I don't even know if that'll work. Double check. No, well, we haven't clicked the button. No, I didn't think it would, but something was telling me I thought it might. So there, response, going to response. So we can see what that looks like now. Okay, so we see we're not getting our data. Like when we console logged this data, we got it. But now we're seeing we're getting this object, and it's an object of the response type. So if we look, we see this object, and we see stuff on the prototype, and we see functions, and we see strings and integers and all different things. So this is one of the differences between fetch and other libraries that do data fetching. A lot of the libraries that do data fetching do exactly what jQuery did and does, where they look at that content type of the response header and infer and try and create whatever it is. Typically JSON, but it might be a content type XML, then they'll try and convert it to XML and such. So we have to do a little bit more work here to turn this into JSON. And there's actually a function here because JSON's so popular and so standard that it's built into the prototype, and we can just convert it. So we will say response .json, and the return value of this is passed into the next piece of the chain when we do .then. So let's call this data now. And see what we get. Okay, we see too large for the console, use the browser console. There are limits to this built-in stuff. Get a little bit bigger. We see we get an array. And it's an array full of objects. And then we just have JavaScript objects that look just like these. Make a character at line 1 column of the JSON data. Huh. Oh, our array's there. I think that's something different. Cool. So we successfully have consumed a different payload with a different method, this time fetch. Now, I talked about using named functions. I think like here on line 10, that not breaking this out is okay. And the reason being the .json function is built into this response. It's part of it. Also, I think it's clean. This isn't going to grow any, it's just going to sit there. It's very explicit. So, okay, we take the response, we convert it to JSON, and then we keep on doing what we're doing. So I wouldn't necessarily break this one out. Although some people do like creating a parse JSON function, something like this. return response.json. And using that throughout their application as like a helper function. So you'll see that around probably. But I typically, these days, just keep that .json in line right here. I think it's clean and it looks all right. And it's very explicit to what's going on. Okay. So we've got our response, we're console logging our data. And now the last pieces of our puzzle. So we don't just want to console log the data, we want to do stuff with it. So let's say we'll create a function and just call it followers success. And like we did before, we could do this just fine. Followers success data, console log the data, open this up and clear it. If I remember, I can't remember. Followers. Followers. Okay. Try that again with it spelled right. I see the array is still console logged. So the same thing is working in fetch the way it worked in the jQuery Ajax method, because that's something about the promise chain. So if you're using promise chains, then you can do that. Like I said before, I think doing something like this is just clearer for all. All right, let's stick this data on the DOM. Get data successfully, yeah. So actually, let's not call this data. Let's be more explicit with that. Let's call it followers array. We have our followers array, and we want to iterate through it all and end up with a bunch of data in our DOM, pretty much like this. I guess this is breaking it. But we want to iterate through the array, excuse me, and attach all these names to our page. So which array method do you think would be best to use here when we're operating on this?
I'm going to guess for each.
And you're right. For each is exactly what we want to use, mainly because we don't need any return value, and we want to iterate through every element of the array, and that's what for each does. We could use something like map, because it will also iterate through everything, but then the return array is of no use to us, so it's actually doing more than we need. So yeah, for each is exactly right. We can say follower. So callback function, and now we're going to do our stuff. Okay. So first things first. What DOM selector should we use? I just killed the screen.
Dot followers?
Yes. Dot followers. And then we can use append again. And how should we structure this now so that we have those list items with the usernames, so the login?
I would do the backtick li and then string interpolation. And then can I see the structure of the data again?
Yeah, of course.
Follower.login. And then close out my li.
Awesome. Boom. It's doing it for us. Awesome. So this is cool. This is awesome. Something I like to point out is that now that these template literals, these string interpolations are available to us between the backticks, lots of times we want to use them everywhere. And I think all of these are fine. But sometimes you might have some really complex stuff going on, and concatenation can be cleaner and look cleaner. So, I just like always showing other ways of doing the same thing for comparing and contrasting. So we can accomplish that way. Sometimes you might have like a long URL like this and has multiple different variables in it, and splitting it apart makes it easier on the eyes to kind of piece it together what's what. So just something that I mentioned because I think it's useful to remember that there are other ways to do things that accomplish the same end goal. So yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left. That's pretty much the end of the discussion lecture notes that I have. Is there anything in particular that you have questions about?
No, I feel a lot better about the append method. And the Ajax is definitely new to me, but I like the $ Ajax is a new syntax for me, but I like the way it works.
Yeah, so have you seen like $.get?
Yeah, that's the one I think I've been working with. I was looking
Okay.
through my notes.
Yeah, so that, if we actually go and look at the documentation, get jQuery.get. We see, if we scroll down just a little bit, this is a shorthand Ajax function, which is equivalent to here.
All right.
So I guess highlighting it made the J disappear. But yeah, so Ajax is kind of the more verbose, more flexible way of doing that. And then .get will just always make it a GET request. So it's it's just a little bit different way of doing the same thing. So everybody kind of has their personal preference on that. Some people like using .get and .post. Some people just like using .ajax for consistency all over the place. But really, they do the same thing.
If you were trying to post some information using .ajax, could you build in the data to that header there, to that hash?
Yeah, so this is get, but so yeah, Ajax takes a whole bunch of things, but URL and then settings. And the settings can take a whole bunch of things, async, before send, cache, complete contents, content type, context, converters, cross-domain data. Typically the data is what you're sending. Data filter, data type. It has so many options. Here's your headers if you need those. But yeah, it takes everything that a data call could need.
Okay. Which do you prefer, the Ajax, the jQuery Ajax, or do you prefer the fetch?
I like fetch. Although and I've seen this very long debate happen and just observed it between people who are much more knowledgeable than me. But so jQuery is much more mature. It's been around a long time. It's probably, if you're working in JavaScript, it's probably in your project already somewhere. So it's probably not even like if you use it adding anything, to your project. As far as people always talk about, like when you add more libraries, then your JavaScript bundle gets bigger and that's more to download and this, that, and the other. But lots of things are already in projects and you just have to look for them. So something about Fetch, because it's a lot newer, is Fetch does have some weird issues with things that are still being ironed out. Lots of times with the headers and some of these other settings that you have to use sometimes with authorization and things that you have to send. Fetch can be a pain to work with. I know I've struggled with it sometimes with certain servers that I've had to interact with. And those things are a lot easier with jQuery, just because they've hit those pain points and they've pushed past them and they've iterated. And we're on version, what it was down here, version 3.1. And I wonder if this has a release date on version 1.0. Release notes. Is there a date on here? 2006. So, it's been 12 years since version 1.0. Lots of stuff has happened. Whereas Fetch, let's find it. Fetch. Here, there's that. Fetch API, more at MDN. I guess they don't have a date. I know it's newer. It's not 12 years old, that's for sure. I think it's within the last 5 years. So there's still some things that just haven't been ironed out. And because it's part of the web API, there's also a lot more like bureaucracy around making changes to it, because if everybody's using it, then you can't just change it. Like we didn't have to add anything to our project here. It's just JavaScript and we write fetch and it works. So if we make a change, we have to, when the JavaScript people decide if they want to make a change to fetch, they have to consider how many, hundreds of thousands or millions of websites are using fetch right now, and will this break them? So it makes it a little bit more difficult to fix things sometimes. But so I typically probably fall on using a library of some sort. Also, where I work full-time during the day, we have our standard libraries that we use. So when we're doing JavaScript, we use Axios for our data, our server things, stuff like fetch and .ajax. So that's just the standard one that they had decided on before I started working with them. And I was writing fetch and I asked somebody a question. They're like, "Oh, we don't use fetch, we use Axios." And I was like, "Okay, no problem." But really, I probably fall on both sides of it. I'm real big on, lots of times they're like non-committal answers, but just knowing what's right for what you're doing. If you have one API call in your project and you don't have Ajax and the rest is all vanilla JavaScript, then use fetch. If you're using jQuery in your project, you're doing a bunch of DOM manipulation and you have it there already, use Ajax or get or post or whatever, something in that library, because it's there. It's going to make your life easier, and there's no point in making our lives harder as developers unintentionally, if we don't need them to be.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah. And if you want to, or if you don't want to work on labs or something and want to do something for a minute, there's the link again in the chat.
Yep, I already bookmarked it.
Cool. So here's a bug. If we click get followers again, it just sticks it on there. It doesn't clear everything out.
Because we're just appending onto the end of it.
Yeah. Yep. So I'll leave you with that if that's something that you want to, figure out on your own at some point in time. But just a little problem that needs fixing to make this kind of the exactly what we would want it to be from a user perspective.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for being interactive and talking and asking good questions. It always makes these study groups much more enjoyable to lead and work. But yeah, have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
You two have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.